From Washington, D.C., I'm Blake Newman.
I'm Brie Ripley.
And this is the Agile Podcast, where we explore the stories and people behind Agile web solutions. In this series, we're talking about Drupal 7's end of life, which means it's losing its support and retiring.
Ooh, retirement, sunbathing, golfing, taking up a new hobby.
Well, Drupal 7 may be retiring, but websites powered by D7 must go on, which presents a problem for anyone running Drupal 7.
Last episode, we talked about one solution to this problem, sticking within the Drupal family and migrating to Drupal 8, or more likely, 9.
But that's a big move for one major reason.
Drupal 8's core, it will now sit on top of Symfony instead of its own proprietary PHP framework.
And moving between these two is a big translation, like going from Italian to Chinese.
So today, we have an episode for the Drupal 7 lovers.
The Drupal 7 fans.
The Drupal 7 stans.
Kind of like those roadies who follow bands all over the world, but instead of setting up a stage, Drupal stans are setting up websites. And we're going to talk about a way to move to a different content management system very similar to Drupal 7. This CMS is called Backdrop, and I'd never heard of it until a couple months ago. I was talking to Gordon. He's a Drupal architect who's appeared in some of the Agile podcast episodes. So we're talking. So how was your weekend?
My weekend was good. It was super eventful.
And we get to talking about Drupal.
As you do.
Right. And I asked him about the impact of Drupal 7's end of life. And he says something that catches my ear.
I don't necessarily think of it as the end of anything. Simply because there was a splinter group probably 5 years ago that decided that they loved Drupal 7 and they were not thrilled with going the Drupal 8 route. So they forked the code.
A splinter group forking the code. This all sounds like the army of the 12 monkeys meets a spaghetti restaurant.
I'm trying to think of this thing with the eye and the Leonidas, or not the Leonidas, anyway, whatever. Right, forking the code. We've joked about that in the past. It's basically making a copy of the code so you can customize it. But this is the first time I'd heard the Drupal 7 code being forked. And it was done by this group of developers who called this new CMS Backdrop, which is a play on words that's really technical, and I'm not even going to explain it.
Come on.
Okay, well, before Drupal was called Drupal, it was called Drop. And after Drupal evolved to where it is today, some developers didn't like where it was going and simply wanted to go back to when Drupal was called Drop. Back to Drop. Backdrop. I called up Nate Lampton, who not only co-founded Backdrop CMS, but also works for a high-profile Drupal shop. Here's Nate.
We took the code base of Drupal 7 and we made a copy of it and put it in a different location and then set a different set of goals for where we wanted to take it. So we started from a common point, but then we diverged in the approaches that we used from that point forward.
So that's amore, or forking the code.
Yep. It's based off a fork in the road. You know, you're going down a single road.
And then all of a sudden you get to a point and you can either go to the left or you can go to the right. And one project goes left and the other goes right.
That's Jen Lampton, another co-founder of Backdrop CMS who runs her own web development company. She works mostly on local government sites and with a few small businesses.
My favorite is a local puppy trainer.
Aww.
And they're my favorite because they have the best content to work on when I get to work on their websites.
Oh, who doesn't love puppies? Well, Jen says that with the way Drupal was going, it became difficult to recommend Drupal to clients.
I sort of specialize in long-term relationships with my websites. And so I have a bunch of clients that I've been working with since Drupal 5, one of them since Drupal 4.7, the same website, still working on it. And every time we come to an upgrade, you have to kind of sit the client down and be like, okay, we're going to do an upgrade. It's really important. You need to keep getting, security updates. You want to make sure your new features are easy to implement, but it's going to cost something.
The worst part, cost can be a little bit shocking from the client side of things.
And in the move to D8, Jen felt like it was too expensive.
And the price tag got to be a point where I did not feel good about going back to these same clients and saying, this is how much it's going to cost to upgrade. In most of the cases for my clients, the cost of that upgrade was more than they paid for their original website. And it felt like that's not That wasn't software that was good for them anymore. It wasn't benefiting them.
So this is a story about being agile.
Yeah, like many Drupal developers, Nate and Jen didn't love the way Drupal was going after Drupal 7. Jen didn't think Drupal was right in terms of price and functionality for her smaller clients. Nate came to this realization while he was working on a module for Drupal 8's core a few years ago.
Back in the day, he was a core contributor to Drupal when Drupal 8 was being built, aka he's got a big-time GitHub following, and he was one of the major Drupal people.
Yep, and Jen was too. Anyway, Nate had submitted this module for review. Then someone came back to him and said he'd have to rewrite the whole thing because Drupal 8 was going to be really different than Drupal 7. And Nate could see this was going to be a problem.
And I just saw this as being inevitable, that we were going to have to rewrite every Drupal website in existence because of this drastic amount of change that was occurring. And I didn't think that that would be possible for the Drupal community to accept, that it was going to be an absolutely enormous cost for every Drupal website out there.
Then, at a DrupalCon,
basically a conference for Drupal people,
Jen and some other developers were talking about how D8 was getting technically frustrating.
And we all kind of looked at each other and shrugged our shoulders and said, hey, if Drupal 8 gets too complicated, we can always fork it. Ha ha ha.
And that's basically what happened. Nate forked it secretly and put it on GitHub.
GitHub is basically a code repository where developers can share and collaborate on code, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Some other developers who followed Nate on GitHub found the repo and started asking about it.
Basically, the code got out.
They blew his stealth mode, and a group of those developers made it official. They wrote down some core values, some philosophies that would steer their CMS in the future, and today, that's Backdrop CMS.
And anyone could fork the Drupal code because of Drupal's license.
Anyone who downloads any distribution of the software has the fundamental right to take it and modify it and then redistribute their modified version.
As long as you keep the same license and don't, sell it.
And if you do this, you end up with something very similar to Drupal 7.
Jen says that Backdrop is basically a carbon copy of D7, but then they made it simpler and easier to set up, install, and manage content.
But what about the community and contributed modules that made Drupal so powerful, and the security of having that community looking out for bugs?
Yeah, the bug catchers. Well, you're right. Drupal has a whole army of people contributing modules that extend functionality and identify security vulnerabilities, create patches. Backdrop just has 200 contributors. Here's Nate again.
In the open source scheme of things, having 200 plus contributors to your open source project is an enormous achievement. Like, that is a large number of active contributors that are working on one software project.
So Drupal's open source community is really big. Maybe even the biggest open source community in the world working on a single software project. Backdrop can't really compete with that, but does pretty well, all things considered. So, what about migration? How much will this cost as a client to maintain?
Well, Backdrop is really focused on their ideal client, nonprofits, small government agencies, companies without a big tech budget. It's about providing maximum value without compromising quality and at an affordable price.
Backdrop started 5 years ago, and Nate says that they're still on version 1.
I mean, we're on Backdrop 1.16, but our plan is to maintain full compatibility within the 1.x version for, I'm going to have to check the end of life date, but I'm pretty sure it's for an additional 2 years still. So very, very long life cycle. And that's because literally philosophy number one is that backwards compatibility is important.
It's super important because they didn't want to repeat the same sticker shock that owners of Drupal 7 sites received when they heard how much it was going to cost to migrate to D8 or D9. Now, here's the rub. While it may be in the best interest of an organization to move to Backdrop, it might not be in the best interest of a Drupal shop. The move to D8 or D9 is massive and time-consuming, which translates into billable hours for a web company. A huge amount of money will likely be spent on it. Nate works at a Drupal shop, and he told me about a Drupal 6 site he built for $40,000. That site was upgraded to D7 for about $100,000. The site hasn't moved to Drupal 8 yet, but the estimates that Nate's team has given them are like $1.5 million. And when you ask about the cost of some of these migrations,
oh dear. Well, so with the agency that I work for, like this is our jam, like taking Drupal 7 sites and then moving them to Drupal 8. I'm not a business person, but I know that these are multi-million-dollar projects. Like I think some of the larger ones have been 5 million plus.
And as we know, Backdrop is much less expensive.
Backdrop doesn't cost enough, honestly.
Nate tells me that he's tried to take on contracts for migrating to Backdrop.
Financial people in my company looked at it and said, that doesn't make business sense for us to allocate people to this project because it just doesn't meet a minimum threshold.
Because it's really cheap.
But you probably have to meet some requirements to make the move to Backdrop. The first is that you likely need a rare Backdrop developer or small Drupal 7 agency because these big fancy ones don't want to touch a project with so little revenue.
So what Nate was talking about with the cost of Backdrop.
Actually, the low cost of Backdrop. And two, you need to be building a site no more complicated than a simple marketing site. If you want to do something more complicated, you may need something more powerful and capable, like Drupal 9 or Symfony. Here's Jen again.
Backdrop is a system specifically for making websites. So if you have a website and not a web system, Backdrop might be a better fit for you. If you need a decoupled framework that includes components from lots of different systems, Drupal is going to be a better fit. But if all you need is a website, Backdrop is going to be faster. It's going to be easier to maintain. It's going to have a better user interface, and it's going to be really good at producing that website.
All right, so Backdrop seems like a really interesting project. Like the people behind it saw this problem and at first, in a joking way, came up with an agile solution. It's genius, like chef's kiss genius. They pivoted and repurposed the Drupal code for something that better serves small clients and nonprofits.
And if it's right for you, Backdrop can save you some time, money, and the headaches of having to migrate every few years. And to be clear, a lot of people are going to stay in Drupal.
I'm not worried that Drupal's going to die, but I do have a handful of clients who are moving to Drupal 8 and 9. And my biggest concern for them is the continued increased cost of the software that they're running, especially for these government agencies. Like they're spending my tax dollars, so I feel it two ways, right? Not only in, the waste of my own tax money, where I feel like they could have chosen a different platform and it wouldn't be as expensive, but also the fact that they've got to factor this into their budgets now in a way that makes everything a little bit less comfortable for them.
So Brie, knowing all this and being someone who manages a state agency's digital presence, what stands out to you about Backdrop?
I mean, first of all, the price. You really can't compete with something that is not going to make higher ups go, oh my gosh, every single time you bring them a budget. Like, if I had $1 for every time I got that reaction. Yeah, they're pretty, They have tight budgets, and digital stuff costs a lot. So this is a total pro.
Well, is there anything you don't like about the sound of Backdrop?
I wish I could say like nothing, but I really can't. Like one of the things that I really appreciate about the Drupal people is the community that they've built, and just how many people are working on patching bugs and working on different iterations and fixes.
Well, that's true, but you know what? I would rather have a handful of brilliant, passionate, committed developers than a ton of others who are just not nearly as passionate or committed.
I see your point.
So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like throwing more developers on a project that does not necessarily make it go faster.
Sure.
And there's also this concept of like a 10x developer where like one really great developer can do 10 times the work of, mediocre developers.
Right.
Well, next week, we're going to present another option of where to go from D7. And this is if you want to leave the Drupal world altogether.
We'll talk WordPress, Wix, and how to better meet your needs through a different content management system than Drupal. So tap the subscribe button on the Agile Podcast, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And please, leave a review while you're at it. Thanks for listening. Till next time.
So long.
The Agile Podcast is produced by Agilina, a DC-based web development company. To learn more about Agilina, you can visit our website, agilina.com, or send us an email to results@agilina.com. That's AGILEANA.com. Hey, Brie, let me play you just one more clip from Jen.
All right.
Backdrop is a system that doesn't assume you're a developer. It's for people. It's for, average people. So it has a graphical user interface for everything. You never need to use the command line if you don't want to. You don't need to get into the code if you don't need to. You don't even need to visit backdropcms.org. Everything you can do can be done from inside the application itself.
Can you believe that? Backdrop's going to put me out of business.
At long last. I'm just kidding, Blake. Free from developers. I mean, I love Backdrop. I just love them. I want to get out from, the tech lingo and the developer world that nobody can really understand.
You know what? I'm a fan too.